Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as ever, David Griscom. Hello, Dave.
How's it going, sir?
It's going well. And joining us once again, Tomas Kennedy. He is an immigration advocate from Argentina, also a podcaster. Why Are We Like This is his podcast. And also sort of a informal Left Reckoning Florida expert. We've had him on a number of times. And to talk, we'll start with the guy himself, Ron DeSantis. I saw him recently on Fox News talking about how Florida's universities are like Ivy League, but for unwoke people, which to me seems like just a slightly worse Ivy League, but I'll reserve my hits for Ivy League to later. But there's actually other stuff going on in Florida, such as like a giant flood and storm. And so just bring us up to speed on that, Tomas.
Yeah, I mean, my parents' house, for example, that's in a flood zone. They were literally with water, right up to the back of their apartment, and every time they were flushing the toilet, just water kept coming up the toilet and the shower because obviously, the drainage system was completely overwhelmed, and this was all across South Florida, from the city of Miami to along, it's 30-something municipalities to Broward County, Hallandale, Hollywood, Palm Beach. Interstate 95 was actually closed down for a significant period of time in the past few days because of, flooding along the highway. And it's worth noting that this is being called a once in a 1,000-year flood event that is equally as acute as last year's once in a 1,000-year event. So these are no longer one in a 1,000-year events. These are annual recurring events, right? And I think what really made this sort of like ironic is that the backdrop to all of this was the Governor DeSantis, finally having the unveiling of the budget, right, and the vetoing of several budget items that he does annually, right. And it's always like a really sort of funny event because he does a press conference with all of the legislative leaders behind them, and then proceeds to just obliterate, all of their appropriations and priorities, and good little cucked boys and girls, they just stand behind them and nod along. But anyway, so regarding to the floods themselves, he vetoed $205 million worth of storm drain funding for projects that would alleviate this recurrent problem right now. So really poorly timed press conference on his part, right?
Yeah, and I just want to, the 1,000-year flood thing, that's something I have in common with Floridians as a North Dakotan, which is that I went to Minnesota State University, which is across the river from Fargo, for 5 years for undergraduate. And 3 of those 5 years, we missed significant time in the spring because we had to go volunteer sandbag the Red River because it was having one of those 1 in 100 year or 1 in 5,000 year floods. And it's like, that was, at the time it felt like you were being alarmist if you said, this might have something to do with that climate change we're hearing about all the time. And just now it's just like a part of anywhere in the country. The old folks realize hey, the weather's changed compared to what it was when I came up as a kid. And it's pretty, how is that registered in Florida? Because, Florida, I guess we have, I'm curious where we are in the DeSantis stage of things. Is DeSantis mania still the order of the day? Are people getting sick of him because of this sort of stuff? Where are we at with attitudes towards the climate and what the state's doing about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he's lost a lot of momentum, since the presidential race. But then again, the reality is that the Florida Democratic Party is a non-entity, completely incompetent. Aside from DeSantis himself, every single statewide cabinet position is held by a Republican. Supreme Court judges in Florida are all Republican, and they have super majorities in both chambers, right? And they're making gains at the municipal level. And that's another thing, it's easy, and I did it, like dunk on the vetoing of the $205 million in the storm storm mitigation flooding projects. But the reality is that the municipalities themselves are also not doing a good job in terms of, moving forward projects to alleviate chronic flooding. I'll give you an example. In the city of Miami, back in, I believe, 2018, we approved a bond called the Miami Forever Bond. It was $400 million for flood mitigation projects. And, I've lived in the city of Miami, for most of my life. And in recent years, you really don't see the impact of those projects, both you don't feel them and you don't see them, right? So you ask yourself, what happened with that money? What happened? It was grifted, right? It went to like contractors and projects to close down streets for a period of time, so that mom and pop shops that were traditionally there were closed down and replaced with larger scale developer projects. So in terms of your question, is we're not serious about tackling the climate crisis, both at the macro level, right, internationally, in terms of like offsetting emissions, but also in terms of like micro level urban planning and climate resilience mitigation, whatever buzzwords you want to use. And it happens both by Republicans and Democrats. A lot of these municipalities in Miami-Dade, for example, are democratically controlled. The mayor of Miami-Dade is a Democrat, and they're not investing properly in what needs to be invested. It reminds me a lot of what's happening in New York right now with congestion pricing. You know what I mean? This was a good opportunity to, reduce emissions, improve air quality, invest in public transit, reduce car traffic. And because idiotic electoral positioning, they scrapped it last minute in this very, very sloppy way, or delayed it, whatever. You see just that same sort of just very short-term, politically motivated, cynical, like, positioning in what needs to be, serious political action. And it's really impacting the day-to-day life of people in Miami now. There was a famous meteorologist that yesterday put out a tweet saying it's actually impacting the finances of people in Miami now. That it doesn't have to be a 1 in 1,000 year flood event, right? It rains in Miami for 30 minutes and the streets are flooded, and that means that your car can get flooded, your house can get flooded, your plumbing can get fucked up, and that means money out of your pocket, right? So it's depressing.
I mean, it really is amazing how much, I feel like people who share our politics sometimes, we talk about like bread and butter issues and things like that. But Florida and New York and Texas, in Texas, we're continuing to have problems with our electrical grid. In fact, ERCOT just announced that they think it's very likely that we're going to have blackouts this summer, which would be absolutely devastating. And we've had regular kind of weather events that have caused significant power outages throughout the state in the past few months. And it's truly amazing to me just to see how politically complacent both the Republican and the Democratic Party are on this. Because, like, look, I don't know the Florida case. I know, like, we're not going to get those guys to do like climate action, right? But at a certain point, it's like if you're going through disaster after disaster, you would expect them to at least try to create a system that works well to respond to these problems, right? Like adaptation. And in Texas, like, it's been a real disaster developing something like that. And I'm just curious, in your, experience in Florida, if you feel like, it's a sad thing, but like, has the state of Florida gotten good at trying to, respond to these major natural disasters that people are experiencing?
They'll band-aid solutions and response whenever we get hit by a hurricane, but the answer is no. And I'd be remiss if I don't talk about this, which is the property insurance implosion in Florida, right? That's sort of become like a political football, but it's very real, right? And there was a pushback by right-wing elements in Florida that don't want to talk about climate change, about, is climate change and extreme weather events really the driving factor, behind the property insurance crisis in Florida? And they say, no, what's happening is the trial lawyers, they're fraudulent lawsuits by the trial lawyers, are putting too much pressure on the property insurance companies. And it's to be fair to the property insurance companies, which, and all insurance companies, which I don't want to be, but the reality is that if the state gets hit by 2-3 storms a year that leave, thousands of cars flooded in the streets and, thousands of homes destroyed, it does become financially unfeasible to insure the state, because the point of insurance is that we all pay into it, and it's a pool of money in case something bad happens, which is not supposed to happen often. And in Florida, that bad thing is happening very, very often. So all these insurers are saying, fuck it. We're gonna stop insuring this crazy state. And there's a insurer of last resort, which is Citizens. It's like the public insurer, and it doesn't have enough reserves to cover all these claims that are happening year after year, multiple times. And we've had, I think, three special sessions. I'm not talking about the annual legislative 90-day session that happens, in Florida. We've had 3 special sessions aside from the annual sessions to try to address this. And what has been the solution that they've come up with? A massive taxpayer-funded bailouts for the insurance companies, the tunes of, I think now $3 billion with a B, with no sort of like regulation or guidance or restriction on what to do with that money. You know what I mean? And, I was watching an interview by a Democratic state senator the other day. This should be a spearhead issue for them. And they asked her in the local news in Florida, in Central Florida, what would you do to fix this issue in the state? And like every single lawmaker and Democratic operative in the state should have a copy and paste response ready to go. And the response was like, well, I would talk with my Republican colleagues to try to bridge some consensus and come up with a solution. Like, come on, man, that is so deeply unserious. So to your answer is no, there's no real seriousness in tackling these issues. And, the last thing I'll say about the property insurance crisis is that it sort of gets dismissed as sort of this like bourgeois thing that only affects homeowners, but it's not. It affects renters because buildings, right, like need to be insured also. And the property insurance of these buildings go up as well. And then that cost is passed down to the tenants, to the renters. It just happened to my mom, who rents, owns a 1-bedroom apartment in North Miami Beach. And they raised the property insurance on the whole building, and that was they did a special assessment on the whole building. So all the people that own apartments there have to pay more maintenance, and then that gets translated to higher rent costs to the people that are renting there, right? So it really is a bread and butter issue that's affecting homeowners and renters.
Yeah, I mean, those articles about the insurance market just seem really concerning for Florida in a way that, like, I mean, it made me think of a bubble, like one, that indicator, and then Dave Rubin also saying it's time to come there. I'm like, the future of Florida seems not like kind of like in a dark spot right now.
I mean, I think that the property insurance thing, it really is just a giant grenade waiting to go off. It's really making it difficult for people to become homeowners. It's really making it difficult for people to just rent. You know what I mean? The state is basically gonna become a renter state. I mean, obviously, there's the issue of private equity buying homes in mass and raising rents on people. There's the fact that the state is preempting, local municipalities from enacting ordinances to help, the everyday people, related to the issue of climate change. There was, I believe it was House Bill 433, a local preemption that blocked local municipalities from enacting predictive scheduling laws, right? So people that work, hourly wages could have a weekly notice on what their schedule is going to be, right? Then it also stopped local municipalities from enacting local living wage laws, right? So if they wanted to raise, Miami, right, which is obviously a different standard of living than, I don't know, any other smaller county in Florida, if they wanted to raise their hourly wage standard to $15 an hour, they can't do it. And I think worst of all, they blocked heat stress protection standards, right? Because Florida does not have a state level heat stress protection standards. So, they wanted to enact in Miami-Dade a very basic standard that ensured access to shade, access to water, and breaks, I believe, once the temperature got to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, it breaks every 10 minutes per every hour, blocked at the behest of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, right? So it's just becoming a really dystopian place to live.
Yeah. I mean, people should, check out the documentary that the Real News Network just put out that I helped put together, like on this preemption thing in Texas, right? I think the last time we had you on the program, I might have told you the joke that they're saying here is like, if you want to predict the future in Texas, read Florida newspapers and vice versa for people in Florida. But I'm curious about how you describe, because this kind of stuff is just so wild to me. These kind of preemptions, these kind of attacks, because like, look, I can have disagreements with like Republicans, so like I might know like in my day-to-day life or things like that, serious ones. But for the most part, I'm not a normal person on the street who votes Republican that I'm talking to is not really worked up about stopping people from having water breaks, on the job site. So you hear things like this and they just seem absolutely ridiculous. And you have to ask your question is, why is this what this Republican government is delivering? And I'm just curious, like how you would sort of describe like this DeSantis era in Florida. Is DeSantis like the mastermind behind this kind of thing? Or is it the Florida Republican Party? I mean, what are like the power dynamics that are sort of pushing this really anti-democratic, really frankly, like anti-common sense legislating that we're seeing there?
Yeah, something that I think is really interesting is that people portray DeSantis and his ilk as sort of these like new right-wing, like populist, these like Peter Thiel, whatever. And like, that's bullshit, man. They're just the same Reaganites of always, but instead of having that sort of like chipper, like sunny, like optimist, America is the beacon of the world, like, Ronald Reagan rhetoric, they're just really negative, right? And it's just all optics. But going back to this heat stress preemption bill, if you go and look up how it was discussed on the committees, right, in the legislature, they were saying shit like, of course, employers want to protect their employees. Of course they do, because a happy employee means a productive worker, and a productive worker means more profit for the employer. So why would we force the employer with needless regulation to have any sort of heat stress standard? It's in their best interest for them to do that, right? And it's that sort of like Dave, to quote Dave Rubin, remember when he was on Joe Rogan and he was like, of course, construction contractors don't need any sort of regulation because it's in their best interest to build something that's, that's going to hold up. And Joe Rogan was like, listen, man, I work construction, and that's not the case. Contractors will cut corners all the time, right? Not to give Joe Rogan too much credit, but he was right on that. And it's the same thing about, agricultural workers or construction workers. No, their employers will grind them to dust. They will squeeze as much work from them as possible. They don't give a shit about their well-being. The role of government is to come in there and set up some basic rules, at least, so that they can be protected in the workplace. And I don't know if the morons in the Florida legislature that say these things believe it or not, but they're saying it, and they're saying it at the behest of, as I was saying, the Florida Chamber of Commerce. A great journalist called McKenna Schuller for the Orlando Weekly got through public records text between Florida Chamber of Lobbyists and the chief of staff of House Speaker Paul Renner, and the lobbyist was literally texting her, heat, meaning the heat stress preemption, cannot die. What are you guys doing about this? This is our top priority. And on their progress report for legislative priorities, they sent out a memo to all legislators saying, we are double weighting the heat stress preemption vote, meaning that they'll get double the negative mark if they vote against it, which means, less access to lobbyist cash and donor funds and et cetera, et cetera. So it's just this, they may act like right-wing populist and whatever and standing up to, woke and gay Disney and whatever. But the reality is that, they're still giving tax breaks. They're still doing their bidding. And it's the same sort of business-oriented Republican Party.
Well, so on that, I know it's not coming up yet, but, the DeSantis era will end, at least him as governor. Is what you're saying is that these structures are sort of outside of, the party that are sort of encouraging this kind of policy here for the Republican Party, that, DeSantis, is no longer governor, whoever ends up taking over, if a Republican wins again, which probably is likely. You're saying that like these structures that are sort of pushing these kind of horrifying laws and things like that we're seeing in Florida, that's sort of almost outside of the party or firmly like in control of the party, those interests.
100%. The only thing that I think could change is the sort of like extreme hardline stance on immigration, because there was a really interesting report that came out in January from the Office of Economic and Demographic Research of the state of Florida, talking about the labor shortages in the state and the horrible demographic trends, because death rates are overtaking birth rates, young people are moving out because of the cost of living crisis, retired boomers are moving in. And the state itself said, we need more immigration, and look, a lot of these, these business interests understand it as well. We need workers straight up, and it's not even the old right-wing trope of, low wage workers bringing down wages for everybody. It's just, we straight up don't have workers. You know what I mean? And, I'm just talking about it in just economic terms here. So I think that kind of stuff could change, but ultimately, the business interests are the entity that are in charge of Florida and that are crafting these type of horrible anti-worker, anti-human legislation.
Yeah, it seems short-sighted. The last thing I'll note before we move on to Biden is I remember there was a study done where Florida, I think state officials had Amsterdam and Copenhagen folks come and say, hey, you guys are below sea level. If these things rise, like, show us how to do it. And the folks got there and were like, yeah, we don't have limestone, which is porous as bedrock, so it's going to be a much more difficult infrastructural task to protect Florida from rising sea level. So you probably want to get on it and not, kick the can down the road would be my advice to Ron DeSantis.
Can I tell you a short story that encapsulates Florida corruption, or at least South Florida corruption? It's related to German contractors. It sort of reminded me. So there was an RFP that went out to synchronize all of the traffic lights in Miami-Dade County a couple of months ago. And they hired a German company to do it that specializes in it, right? And all of a sudden, the Miami-Dade County Commission got a hold of this, and they started questioning why this German company that has an excellent track record and are experts in doing this. Why did they get this contract? And it turns out that the commissioners were not happy about it. They canceled the contract and they gave it to a basically like a Florida pop-up contractor that had no real record of doing this. And, obviously, the Miami Herald got a hold of this. They investigated it. And what happened was that it turned out no one told the German company that in Miami-Dade County, you're supposed to bribe the commissioners with campaign donations to get, a contract like that. And they just gave no donations to the commissioners. And this new company had given donations to all of the people in charge of approving the new contract. So that's the way that business is done in Miami-Dade County, just through sheer bribery.
See, this is why you need humanities majors, right? You need to understand the culture of the place that you're working in.
I was just going to say, this sounds like everything I've read about like India or something like that. It's like, no, you got to understand how to get things done there.
Yeah, cultural competence is important.
Well, that kind of brings us to the other end of the spectrum. Well, I mean, in a manner of speaking, but our boy Joe Biden has, completed a betrayal. We've commented here, but you wrote this piece in Truth Out here. Biden opposed Trump's asylum ban in 2018. Now he's implementing it. Yeah, Thomas, what's your opinion on what Biden's doing here?
I mean, it's just terrible. I've been an immigrant. I was undocumented myself. I got married and I was able to adjust my status, but I've worked in the immigration nonprofit space for about 10 years. And I've been involved in some serious immigration related fights, and in Florida, between 2016 to 2020, I remember marching, lockstep with liberals, with Democrats about the Homestead Detention Center for Children, for example, and the Muslim bans at the airports, right? When we all rushed out of our homes, to make it to the nearest airport, or, the 2018 asylum ban, right? And it's just incredibly discouraging to see the reaction and, the apologies, the excuses being made for what is essentially a replication, an exact replication that cites the same authority under the Immigration and Nationality Act that Trump did to create an asylum ban that basically shuts down the border between ports of entry for asylum seekers. It's just incredible to me, right? And, I wrote this piece because, a lot of people in the immigration advocacy world, the immigration nonprofit world are, sort of kind of twisting themselves into a pretzel right now to make excuses for this and to sort of engage in doublespeak. But you got to call it out like it is, and this is just wrong, and it's a complete betrayal, and it's just completely inconsistent, not with Biden's record, because it is completely consistent with Biden's record, but it is inconsistent with the promises he made while running in 2020, right, which he would protect asylum, which, by the way, it's something that's protected under both national and international law, and that it's something that stems from the Holocaust, right? World War II, right. And the fact that, we denied people, that were facing a genocide and warfare and whatever, refuge in our country and turned them back to die, in Europe. And that's literally where these laws were architected from. And we're just turning back the clock on all of that. And it's just so incredibly discouraging that, it's happening under a Democratic administration that's replicating the policies of Donald Trump, of all people.
Well, I mean, I'm just curious, your reaction to some of these excuses that we've been seeing. I mean, so last week during our bonus episode, Matt and I looked at a column by Nicholas Kristof, everyone's favorite New York Times columnist, who basically admitted that, yes, all of this is Donald Trump's policy. But Trump, if Biden doesn't do this, Trump will become president. And if Trump becomes, sorry, it's so confusing that it's hard to get it right. If Biden doesn't do this, Trump becomes president and does this anyway. Now, Biden being able to do it, we can at least do it in a more orderly and professional manner than this. I mean, it's absolutely. I will editorialize this a little bit. I mean, it's absolutely wild for these guys to completely take the mask off, to use the cliche, and say that like the difference between us and like these barbarians or fascists or whatever they call Republicans is that like we do it kind of like orderly and nicely and properly, and they do the terror kind of with bravado and chaos. Which I don't know, it was a really amazing admission from them. But I'm just curious, like, your perspective on like these heel turns that we've been seeing from a lot of major figures in the kind of liberal to centrist world on this policy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of contradictions. I actually wrote another piece on Truth Out a couple of months ago, because let's remember, right, this asylum ban executive action stems from the failed negotiations regarding the so-called bipartisan border bill, right? That was negotiated by Senator Langford, Senator Sinema, and Senator Murphy, right? That was a terrible bill, but it's actually less harsh than the asylum ban instituted by Biden. And that to me, I have been discouraged by Biden even before everything that's happening with Gaza. I mean, that was just the breaking point for me. But seeing the negotiations around this immigration bill, to me, really crystallized the contradiction, because not only are we destabilizing the Middle East yet again, massacring or at least aiding the massacre of these people, but then we do that, and when they try to seek refuge in our country, we basically tell them to go fuck themselves. And like, that is just to me so morally reprehensible and against the spirit of everything, the so-called resistance, and all the anti-Trump people fought against during the last 4 years, and you just can't do an about face in the period of 4 or 5 months and tell us that the same politics that equated to fascism under Donald Trump, and I believe that they do, all of a sudden are okay because of sheer electoralism, right? And I just also want to add that I personally, and might not matter what I personally think, I mean, who the fuck am I? But I think that we should allow people in this country, because just on a humanitarian basis, right? That's just my personal perspective. But if you want to be, have a colder analysis about it, we are not full in this country, at all. And as I said, we have very, very acute worker shortages across the country. Do I think that the border could be better managed? There could be better logistics in terms of coordinating, between municipalities, cities, states, right? And we could do things better, of course, right? I mean, the White House they don't have a dedicated liaison between the White House, and DHS and CBP and USCIS and whatever. There's not a liaison between that and, the border, states and cities to coordinate action. That's crazy, right? I mean, you had an article in the Washington Post that I believe the headline was, New York and Chicago, brace, with the influx of migrants, cities in the Rust Belt are asking for them. And it was Ed Gainey, the mayor of Pittsburgh, basically saying, Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, please send us buses of migrants. We need them here in Pittsburgh. We have a huge worker shortage. Send us migrants. So there are places, like Detroit, for example, right? Or St. Louis, places that the population is severely declining, where the municipalities are saying we actually need migration into these places, right? So the problem is a lack of imagination, a lack of resourcing, a lack of competence. And instead of just, making the best out of this, not even a problem, opportunity, we are just engaging in the lowest common denominator and throwing these migrants under the bus, and we're doing it under a Democratic administration. It's just gross.
It's just an insane symptom of racism that we look at these people as if they are a threat and not like salvation to a country that needs new people. I mean, the Libertarian candidate, I don't know if you saw this, but His platform was fucking pretty great. Here it is. This is from a guy who doesn't like it. Mass amnesty for millions in the U.S. illegally, path to citizenship for DACA, Ellis Island-style mass processing, expansion of H-1B work visas. Is there anything that you would emphasize that's missing there? Like, I'm curious, like that, because I was shocked to see that. And to be fair, lots of libertarians were not happy to see that position taken by their candidate.
Well, I actually worked with I have never worked for clarity, but I've worked alongside in campaigns with the Cato Institute and other libertarian think tanks, because their lack of support for any sort of government regulation or control of anything leads them to often have a pretty good view on open borders, right? Again, it might be different than our political ideology or lens, but it leaves a lot of room to work together with them on that type of stuff. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they actually had that platform. They're usually pretty good on immigration. You
want an Ellis Island style mass processing center? Like, that's, to me, that is state capacity that is desperately needed. And it's one thing that, like, again, like, my ancestors came through Ellis Island like 120 years ago. That memory is still talked about as if it's like a primordial, like foundational family memory. And isn't it great that this country allows that? I do not think that people are, I think people have gotten pretty racist. Like, there's like a racist culture here, but I do not think that it's so ingrained that people can't be put back onto the Ellis Island thing as opposed to a giant wall thing. I just think you need to have some kind of leadership for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's another problem, right? That the Democrats, especially the Biden administration, Julian Castro was talking about this. They have not presented a policy vision, right? Or even just a broad, sort of like messaging horizon on what a compassionate and humane and smart immigration system could be, right? I mean, every time they get challenged on it, they sort of retreat to the right. It's really just discouraging. And then another thing I want to say about the Nicholas Kristof piece is that from just, I think, an organizing or, policy advocacy lens, like, you should criticize the asylum, ban policies, because it creates pressure, at least from the left on the Biden administration, to at least do something good, right? I mean, we're expecting a following executive action next week that basically, I don't want to get too wonky here, but if you cross the border illegally without any sort of visa stamp, and then you marry a U.S. citizen, like I did, but I came in a tourist visa and overstayed it. But if you do it illegally through the border with no visa, you can't actually petition for adjustment of status through marriage, because you have to leave the country and wait about 10 years to do so. And that's something that happened because of a law called IRARA that Joe Biden supported in 1996, right? That created this barrier. So they're about to fix this via executive action, and it would impact close to 1 million people, undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens that are unable to adjust status that way. I don't want to give too much credit to the Biden administration for this, even though I think it's a great thing, because we shouldn't have to trade asylum for it. I mean, what the fuck? Yeah. But if you don't criticize them and you don't put pressure on them, they'll just say, okay, cool, asylum ban, that's it. That's all you get. So I don't even understand, again, someone like Nicholas Kristof doesn't even give a shit about migrants. They only just care about the election. And
he felt a little embarrassed, and he needed to write, in a kind of snide way why it's okay.
They're just mad that Trump, this is rude and, broke all the Washington, D.C. norms, and they don't actually give a shit about policy or the day-to-day lives of people. But I do, right? And I just think that piece which I read was just atrocious.
Well, I'll just say this is immigration, just like conversations we have policing and homelessness, which we're not going to get into right now. A lot of these stem from one thing. It's like a complete fear of using the government to improve people's lives, creating programs and things like that. I'm not trying to be flippant here, but I've been joking since Abbott started doing the busing thing that, like, man, in a nice, like, social democratic America, I could imagine a very nice system where you walk across the border and somebody says, "Where would you like to go? Here's a bus ticket." We move people around. And, he's not doing it in that way. They're tricking folks and all that kind of thing. But, the irony is you said something earlier about, like, imagination, right? And the really dark thing is, like, the only people who are sort of imagining are, like, psychopaths like Abbott, right? Who are, how can I turn this into more theater? I'll create like a nationwide busing system. When that, could easily and should be, some form of federal policy along with support, because it's very true that, like, in South Texas, these small towns, they can't absorb just, like, flows of people, right? Just, like, logistically, it's very it's difficult and for these small towns to deal with that, right? You need to have a federal government there helping people out, coordinating folks, all this kind of stuff, and that creates resentment. The right uses that to stoke racism and all this kind of stuff. And again, the liberals, instead of, like, thinking of a way to actually create, like, positive programs that maybe give people jobs and help folks out, it's like, oh yeah, let's just tackle a little bit to the right, which we're always going to lose to the psychopaths who are willing to go way further than we ever will. I mean, it's so depressing, to just realize just how weak their kind of political vision is on this question.
David, you bring up such a good point, and there's actually a case study that illustrates what you're talking about, which is the case study of Colombia, right? In 2017, 2018, there was a massive exodus of Venezuelans into Colombia, right? I mean, an exodus of Venezuelans all over the continent, right? And we exacerbated by U.S. sanctions and both, economic mismanagement in the country, whatever. But there was an exodus of Venezuelans. Colombia, instead of taking the U.S. approach, which is to say asylum ban, right, and being racist and on all of that crap, they said, actually, this is a really good opportunity for us. And over 1 million Venezuelans influxed into Colombia, by the way, which is a much smaller country than ours and a lot poorer, with a lot less resources. And what they did is they basically created workplace programs for Venezuelans in border regions, workforce training. They coordinated with municipalities across the country to see where they could place these migrants. They invested in housing for these migrants that was later turned into housing for Colombians and other folks. And you know what? It didn't actually create much resentment. I mean, there's always going to be, anti-immigrant sentiment. I don't want to, discount that, because there was. But who was elected as president of Colombia after this influx of Venezuelans? Gustavo Petro, a pretty leftist leader who is not anti-immigrant by any means and supported a lot of these, holistic humanitarian ways of dealing, with this migrant influx. So that's a case study of, a good, approach of dealing with these sort of, massive displacements of people that are happening because of decreased standards of living worldwide. And it's just sad, not trying to knock Colombia here, but it's just sad that Colombia can handle this and not the United States, the so-called richest country in the world or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a world where America could just be like, yeah, we'll take your laborers, come on in, guys, and then it becomes a problem for other countries that lost all those people, and you start looking like, well, maybe we need to make sure we're not, for instance, sanctioning Venezuela's oil industry into smithereens. Yeah. Tomas, anything else before we let you go?
No, I do want to say, to that last point you made, Matt, that the immigration advocacy world in the United States, the nonprofit ecosystem really does need to start looking, because, we always hear about this root causes of migration, right? And there's a lot of them. But the U.S. sanction regime, not to discount bad governance, elsewhere, but the U.S. sanction regime is exacerbating those root causes of migration and leading to mass displacements of people. So, if we really want to have an honest conversation about that, we really need to start dealing with that. And there's an organization, I think it's called Just Foreign Policy, that does amazing work on this. I just wanted to leave it at that.
Cool. Well, here's Tomas's links here at Tomas Ken on Twitter. Why Are We Like This podcast, and also the newsletter of the same name. Thanks so much, man. It's always great talking to you.
No, likewise. A lot of fun.